The Canadian Railroad spans 4,000 miles across 10 provinces of the most spectacular scenery on Earth.
Trains have attractions that airplanes don't, like putting your head out of the window.
But now this train is coming to the end of the line.
It was a good thing I saw it when I did, because the train I was on isn't running anymore.
Ride the rails with Murray Sayle on the last train across Canada.
All aboard!
Presentation of this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
As a journalist, I've been on the road 40 years, 70 or so countries, all the continents, too many wars and revolutions. I've got packing down to a fine art. I was off to a huge, lonely country I'd never had a chance to see, partly because not much newsworthy ever seemed to happen there. Until now. I was taking the last train to go right across Canada. The Canadian Railway runs from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, 4,000 miles of iron road that spans 10 provinces, 5 time zones, swamps, mountains, and frozen desert. It's a trip I've always wanted to make, and then I heard it was closing down for good. It was now or never. The railway had built this country and tied it together from sea to frigid sea. What would happen to Canada when it disappeared? I began my journey in the Atlantic fishing town of Sydney, Nova Scotia. I've always been rather intrigued by this Sydney because I come from the other Sydney, halfway around the world.
Where are you from?
Sydney.
You're from Sydney and the first time you're in Canada?
Correct. The real Sydney.
Oh, Sydney, Australia.
You got it. Half our mail.
Oh, you're
disappeared.
down under.
Exactly.
You're down there, boy. You want a card?
Okay. Got it.
Got her?
There we are. Thanks, George. Thanks.
Welcome.
And the railway station's down that way.
Yeah, down that way.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Okay, buddy.
That fish was fresh then, but it's a long way across Canada. Tactfully, I dropped it off at the hotel and collected my baggage.
Ladies and gentlemen, Via Rail Canada's rail liner for North Sydney, Sydney Mines, Port Hawkesbury, New
Not many
Glasgow,
tourists take this train.
Toronto,
Atlantic Canada is economically
Halifax.
dying,
All
and
aboard.
sadly, its principal exports seem to be people heading west to look for work.
Okay, guys.
You going to Vancouver?
Vancouver, all the way, sir, yep. Good aboard, up to the left, open down, smoke, and back down from the walls.
And even sadder are some of the people who stay behind.
All aboard! Okay.
And so I joined the migration west, from which many passengers never come back.
The sun was setting in the west, the birds were singing
Scotia people seem haunted by the sadness of saying goodbye to the sea.
Oh, Murray's my name.
Murray. My name is Bernice.
Oh, hello, Bernice. Hello. How are you? How are you? And where do you come from?
I come from Newfoundland.
Oh.
Corner
Trains are great for meeting people. I soon met Bernice from Newfoundland, a Canadian island province they call the Rock. I was her first Australian. In fact, Bernice had only left her island home for the first time a few years ago.
When I got off the Rock, when I left the Rock, I was 33 years old when I left the Rock.
For the first time?
Yeah. I used to think about it when I was small. What was the outside world like? What was the other places like, right? I was only small, I never traveled, right? You know, are the people different from where I come from, where I'm at, right?
What about this train? You've been on this one before?
No, this is my first time on the train.
First time on a train? Really? Well, how do you like it?
I think it's great. It's beautiful. You see all the trees.
You get a great view, don't you?
It is gorgeous, I tell you. The birch trees and the poplar trees, that's the most trees that ever glows in the woods. They're the ones that shows up Mother's nature. It does. And the maple trees, I forgot that.
Yes, there's a lot of maple trees around here. I've already noticed that, yeah.
You did, I. So now?
Now, this is all new to me, you see. I haven't seen a maple tree before.
You never
I mean, except from on the flag, there's a maple leaf, but
You never seen a maple tree?
Wasn't sure what they looked like.
You don't know what you're missing, either.
This train was only a small branch line, an 8-hour run that connected up with the main Trans-Canada line. It collected people in villages along the way, taking them to Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, the big world around the bend.
0, 1, 0, 1, 8, Sydney, check division. No alarm.
You ready?
Many of these young people were out of work. Their region is poor and getting poorer, partly because the fishing industry is dying.
Codfish jigging, that's what they're doing. That's what's nice, Mother, codfish jigging. I used to do that. Yeah, so nice when you get some on a jigger. When you hook some, I used to get them like that. My friend took me out one time in the boat. Yeah, some fun. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful, my dear.
Oh, look over there. The ducks, or geese, I imagine. Yeah, it's geese. That's geese. They haven't all left yet. Still
We crept up over Old Joe Hill and stole a pair of sheep. I like to tell you a story, and although I'll make you laugh, we couldn't take any chances, so we had to steal the cow. The old cow got angry, and we woke her from her sleep. We couldn't take any chances, and we went and stole the sheep.
Go with the spoon.
1, 2, 3, everybody. I divide to build a boat, and I divide the sailor. I divide to get the fish, I'm bringing them out the lighter. I don't want your maggoty fish, they're no good for winter. I can catch better than that down upon the blister.
Down the pier, down there. Where you want a party?
They sounded cheerful. I thought they were happy to be going back to work in Toronto, Canada's biggest city. But I was wrong.
A lot of people up there, a lot of hustle and bustle. I didn't like it at all.
You know how your friends are when you're home. Like, in the community at home, there's, you can go 20 miles easy around the whole place, and everybody's your friend. Up there, you don't know anybody that's even next door. totally different.
Everybody's out for themselves up there. They just look after themselves. I don't know.
The people that goes away from Newfoundland, I don't think they should have to go away. No, I think that's a crime. There's no jobs. They gotta go away. They gotta bar up their homes, and they gotta go up there to make a living. Enough to get their unemployment, and they comes back and that's it, and then they gotta go back again. I figure years to come, nobody is gonna be in here. It's gonna be a ghost town.
I grieve to leave my native land. I grieve to leave my comrades all.
This train doesn't run anymore. Soon after my trip, it closed.
And the bonny, bonny land that I
It was time to start a little background reading. Coming up was my first stop and my first Canadian city, the famous old naval port of Halifax.
The train from Sydney is now arriving on track 1. The train from Provenance to Sydney arrives at La...
300 miles covered, only 3,500 to go. Berenice had got off one stop earlier, but I'd made another new friend. His name was Tom Gallant, a one-time singer who's now a full-time sailor. He invited me aboard once I'd looked around Halifax. People here certainly haven't forgotten where they came from. Halifax is the capital of Nova Scotia, which means New Scotland. This was British North America. And at first sight, it still looked to me more British than North America. Canada only got its own maple leaf flag 25 years ago, and some places still don't seem to have heard about it. The British war against their rebellious American colonies was fought from Halifax. Here, they don't seem all that pleased that George Washington won. I could see a Canadian identity was emerging here, but slowly, almost reluctantly. Perhaps it's because Nova Scotians were comfortable with the British Empire. In fact, geography's put them a lot closer to Britain than they are to the far-off provinces of Western Canada. Life in Halifax isn't all fish and chips. I'd stumbled on the autumn Mardi Gras, a citywide bash that takes over the whole of downtown. Some local natives had decided on dinner. Me. Even a Halifax street party has a certain British respectability. They say that Canada was founded on the values of peace, law, and order, values that came from Britain. I could still see that law-abiding legacy. Among 70,000 all-night revelers, only one minor crime was reported, an inept mugger who was arrested the next day. Next morning, I dropped in on the nearby town of Lunenburg to take up my invitation to go sailing. My friend Tom had found a freedom rare in Atlantic Canada, the freedom to be able to stay at home. Born here in Nova Scotia, he'd moved to Toronto and become a successful entertainer. Then he gave it all up to come back to the sea. Today, Tom's scratching out a living as a part-time skipper leading tourist cruises. He's turned his back on the good life for what he thinks is a better one. I've done a bit of sailing myself. I once crossed the Atlantic alone, so I know a few of the old seafaring traditions.
Right.
Well, Murray, speaking of old nautical expressions and traditions, when we go to sea out here, we take one of these bottles of this here stuff, and we give a drink to the old man. There you go, buddy. Stay out there. And then we have one each ourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you. Welcome aboard.
Mm. Oh.
That's a nice blend, isn't it? It's a good week.
This is rum drinking's a big thing in Nova Scotia, right?
It's the national alternative.
Alternative to what?
To everything.
I say,
To hell with it. Let's get drunk.
Yeah.
When I sail back here, and we're coming into Lunenburg, the last 6 hours coming in, I'm in a state of ecstasy that's almost impossible to hold inside my heart. You know, it's so strong. And there's no, I don't think there is any reason for it. It's just where I belong.
You're coming home.
It's where I belong. The dream of everybody in Toronto is to move to New York or Los Angeles and be a star.
Yeah.
The dream of everybody in Nova Scotia is to be able to afford to stay here. That's the difference. You can't let the rum go, Pop.
Unlike sailboats, trains run on timetables. And the way the skipper was passing around the rum, I was going to have a hard time catching my train.
Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you. Away, you rolling river. Oh, Shenandoah.
Back on the track. Now I joined the main line, the transcontinental train to Montreal that was part of the Canadian Railway legend. Up until the 1950s, this was one of the world's most glamorous trains. In those days, the jet set was the train set. A romantic world of sweeping cars and chance encounters.
Well, what room we don't have in the hallways, we have in the bedroom.
Trains have attractions that aeroplanes don't. Like putting your head out of the window. And if you're learning to count, you can count telephone poles.
19, 20, 21, 22.
Canada has lots of scenery, and there's really only one place to view it from, that indispensable Canadian invention, the dome car. It's ideal for seeing a country where practically everyone seems to have been born within the sound of a train whistle.
And where's this?
All right, you want to see my house?
It's over there.
There it is, right over there.
Yeah, over there.
There it is, you can see
Yeah.
it. My house, the house I was born. The house I was born in. She knows where it is, right over there. Across at the base of the hill.
This railway was the great Canadian dream, an iron road driven through an impossible wilderness. And it's much celebrated in Canadian myth and music.
There was a time in this fair land when the railroad did not run. when the wild, majestic mountains stood alone against the sun. Long before the white man and long before the wheel, when the green, dark forest was too silent to be real.
Many countries built railways. Canada may be the only one built by a railway. The train welded Canada together, a steel wedding band uniting the people of the second great nation of North America. The border between Canada and the United States is the world's longest undefended frontier. But psychologically, Canada was defended by a railway that stretched right along the border, pulling people east and west and barring the way south. Many Canadians were once Americans who fled the American Revolution. They wanted to build a second America that would stay loyal to the British Crown. The railway was to be their main line of defense, holding together a new country which combined the boots and Stetson of the American cowboy with the security of the British redcoat. I was now entering the province of New Brunswick, settled by American refugees passionately loyal to the British Empire, as I learned from a young man I met on the train.
You got to remember, a lot of Canadians were on the opposite side of the American Revolution, the United Empire Loyalists, and there's a lot of those in Ontario. A lot of people are descended from.
And you think that there's still the feeling of the Empire Loyalists strong in Canada?
Damn right there is. They think, you know, the American Revolution was a mistake. Yeah. We didn't have the violence, we didn't have the bloodshed, and we've achieved political independence as much as they have, and we didn't have to go through all the violence and chaos that they had. We never fought a civil war in this country yet, and hopefully we never will.
So maybe that revolution was a bad idea?
I think the American Revolution was a mistake. You have two sides to a revolution. You have those people who want change, and you have people who don't want change. And obviously the United Empire Loyalists and the Canadians that are now are the people that were the conservatives in that part of the revolution. They wanted to maintain the status quo. Yeah, I think basically Canadians are pretty conservative people.
Are you personally conservative? I don't mean politically, I mean in your...
Oh yeah, very conservative.
You are?
That's part of being Canadian, yeah.
Rolling through the wilderness called for some entertainment, and the passengers supplied it. Though Canadian enthusiasm is not of the knee-slapping variety. Even here on the Trans-Canadian train, the United States is never far away. In fact, it's right outside the window. The Canadian tracks take a shortcut through the American state of Maine, which juts into Canada between Halifax and Montreal. And a US border guard gets on the Canadian train.
What are we doing here? This is our Canadian-American customs here. I forgot to look. Who's there?
The guard's job is to make sure all the doors are locked and sealed shut. Just in case some reckless Canadian should suddenly fling himself off the train in pursuit of the American dream just outside the window. It was my first night on the train, and I was curious to try out the Canadian sleeping car. As it happens, it's a Canadian invention, dating back to 1857, and not much changed since those days. morning. Montreal, Canada's most cosmopolitan city. Time for my first sortie into Canadian big city life. It's the world's second largest French-speaking city, famous for sharp dresses and chic coiffures. A big, sophisticated town where, I've been warned, an immaculate toilette is de rigueur. At first glance, this could be the skyline of any big North American city. 2 million people and 4 million cars. This is the province of Quebec, the last remaining stronghold of French in North America. People here just don't speak the same language. In fact, I was surprised to discover that for over a decade, it's been the law of the province of Quebec that all outdoor signs must be in French only. These are real French fries. Signs in English are outlawed, right down to the last apostrophe. What could be more American than a marathon? But the crowd was cheering them on in French. I heard that many Quebecers were demanding independence under their own flag. They're led by the Parti Québécois, a movement striving to separate from Canada. But I had to come here to discover just how deep and widespread Quebec nationalism runs.
No, it's not really for politics. It's like, it's a symbol, I don't know how to say that, symbole. Okay, un symbole. Ça nous appartient. It's our.
And, oh yeah. If I choose for me.
Le Parti du Québec.
Le Parti du Québec, yes.
It's the Parti Québécois. It's because we want the independence for the Quebec. We want to be a country.
Wouldn't that cut Canada in half?
Yes, but we are not. We don't. I don't live in Canada. I live in Quebec. Yeah. For me, it's my country is Quebec. It's not Canada.
To brush up on my Quebec history, I dropped in on Quebec City, the capital of the province, just down the line from Montreal. Here, 95% of the population speaks French, a last remnant of the days when the French Empire ruled 2/3 of North America. This place reminded me of the rainy province of Brittany in France, because long ago that's where most French Quebecers came from. You don't really feel you're in North America here. You're either in Montmartre or in Hollywood. But Quebec isn't just famous for French architecture. The future of all North America was decided here, on one famous battlefield. And there's only one way to see it.
But before I get too far, the date of Quebec City, 1608. Yeah, founded by Samuel de Champlain. Look at these houses down in here now, the average in the 200 years. These houses. Really? This is old Quebec. Hello, how are you? Oui, attends bien. Mademoiselle. The battle took place, it was 13th of September, 1759. That's where they fought the French and British.
The battlefield looks more like a park today. But it was here that the French Marquis de Montcalm lost the battle and his life to British General James Wolfe.
How how the British did it, come up the river, see?
Yet the British didn't really win either. With the French threat gone, the American colonies no longer needed British protection, and so they launched their revolution. In a sense, both the United States and Canada were born here, while another nation died, the Empire of New France. Quebec City would have been its Washington. Perhaps that's why French Canadians are so determined to defend their language and culture in their corner of the world. In a way, the Battle of Quebec has never ended.
I get real upset and I get real sick, you know.
Basically, we'd like another beer.
Yeah, I would like it.
This is about the only thing
Last night in Quebec, I ran into two Quebec newspaper columnists, English columnist Nick Auftemar and French columnist Gerald Leblanc. 200 years after the battle was over, they were still fighting it.
Deep down, you don't agree deep down that it's not, we cannot take that for granted, being a French society in North America. You have to kind of help it and help it a lot. You don't accept that deep down.
Who is you?
The English-speaking people in Montreal.
We accept being a minority, but we'd like to, like all minorities, we'd like to be accepted. And it's very hard to think that we're respected or accepted when you find that our language on public display on a sign is as poisonous to the majority collective society as the AIDS virus is. You know, I mean, that's the way we're made to feel.
Are we talking about language or are we talking about politics? Who's the boss?
We're talking about, power.
Power. Who's the boss?
Yeah, right.
Okay, now we're discussing who's the boss in Canada or who's the boss in Quebec?
Well, I don't know. Sometimes I think, you know, the old adage, I don't know if you heard about Canada, they said Canada was a very lucky country that we had access to French culture, American know-how, and British politics. And we ended up with American culture, British know-how, and French politics.
No, that's good.
So, who won the Battle of Quebec? To an old war correspondent like me, the conflict seemed too friendly to be serious. French Canadians seem to have flourished here as if they'd won the Battle of Quebec. And Canada has gained a unique dual culture that no other country has. I felt very much at home in both parts of Canada. I wish they'd stop fighting that old battle, because both sides have too much to lose. Another day, another train. This is Canada's ritziest train, heading to Canada's glitziest city, Toronto. They even pass out free televisions.
Yes, good morning. It's Rita Martineau. May I speak to the NFA, please? Thank you. Well, listen, the train is behind, is late, okay? I'll be arriving around...
These people are on their way to work, 5 hours away, in a train that thinks it's an airplane.
Would you like some orange juice?
And predictably, this is the train that's expected to survive and get even glitzier when the rest of the train system is gone.
Breakfast? Yes. Okay. This is to start you off.
Everything here feels rather American, and that seems to trouble some Canadians. They wonder why they can't have a strong Canadian identity to match that of their neighbor on the other side of the border.
There are some differences that the Canadians feel between themselves and Americans, but I think part of our concern about Americanism is that we really want to be different. We haven't quite been able to define what that difference is. It's always difficult when you're at some international function and every country is supposed to sing a song or do a dance which represents their nationality. Canadians always have a problem. I mean, they can't do a square dance, that's as American as Canadian, so we end up singing Alouette, most of us who don't speak French. But beyond singing Alouette, we find it a little difficult to say, now, there's a Canadian song, or there's a Canadian dance, or there's a Canadian piece of theater.
I was off to meet Canada's foremost railway authority, Pierre Burton, author of many books on the railway he calls the National Dream. Burton lives in Toronto. It was a small town on Lake Ontario with only 1,600 people when the railway was built. Now it boasts over 3 million. This is a train for people in a hurry. They just can't wait to get to the office. I'd arranged to meet author Pierre Burton in Toronto's Union Station. He's a big man who took me on a tour of an enormous station that looked more like a cathedral.
It's based on romance. It's based on the great Canadian myth. Think of it this way. Every country has an epic story in their background, which they look up. The Spanish Armada, the French Revolution storming the Bastille, the American Revolution, the Vortrek, and the Long March. We're the only one in which there's no blood. We're the only country in the world in which our great mythic endeavor is the building of a railway.
So there's a kind of a mythical or almost religious quality about the railway then?
Yeah, well, look at this building. This
It
is
looks
the
like
temple.
a temple, yeah.
This based on the Roman baths of Caracalla, they tell me. It is a temple, as all Canadian major railway stations are, because there is a religion about railways, or at least, as you say, a myth. The Canadians have a different attitude towards railways than most people in the world because, not only because the railways started the country, but because the country is shaped like a railway. I mean, 90% of our people live within 200 miles of the border. So what we are, a country, from a population point of view, 4,000 miles long, 200 miles thick, with an archipelago of population islands dispersed between enormous barriers, the angry ocean, the white-plumed mountains, the vast Canadian Shield, 1,000 miles of rock and muskeg, the psychological barrier of Quebec. So in this country, transportation and communication are terribly, terribly important and romantic.
The train may be romantic, but Toronto certainly isn't. It seemed to be a bad case of the North American edifice complex. There's that flag again. This is where the money came from to build the railway. An old-fashioned puritanical town where, as the Canadian joke goes, people say, "Thank God it's Monday." Yet I could see that the toil of dour Torontonians has created the most Canadian of cities, a tolerant, hard-working town that lets anyone who shares its values share its prosperity. Toronto made me wonder whether Canadians haven't already found their long-sought identity in the many identities they've been able to tolerate without crushing. Cynthia is the owner of a small Toronto store.
Jamaica, I see, yeah. You don't come from Jamaica?
Yeah.
You do? That explains it, huh? How long have you been here?
I'm here 21 years.
Ooh. Well, do you think your children feel Canadian?
Well, really, who is a Canadian anyway? I haven't been to school here, but I don't really know who is a Canadian. So when I'm in Toronto, I'm a Canadian, and when I'm in Jamaica, I'm a Jamaican. I can't figure this out. Who is the Canadian? I used to hear they say the Indians.
Yeah.
Now, you see the whites, they say they are Canadian. So who is the Canadian?
I guess anybody who lives here is a Canadian.
Well, I'm a Canadian.
Okay.
I see.
Next day, I caught up with the Trans-Canadian line just outside Toronto joined by some more picturesque passengers. They were members of the Amish sect, out on a weekend trip and exercising their right of free song. Ahead of me was some of the most spectacular scenery and some of the most forbidding terrain to face the railway builders. I just read about a Canadian Prime Minister who said, people came to Canada to escape history, only to find themselves overwhelmed by geography. This track was the bravest decision in the railway's history. The easy route would have been to go south through the farmlands of the United States. To stay in Canada, they had to blast their way through the Canadian Shield, 1,000 miles of the oldest, hardest rock in the world. There aren't many towns out here, so the big excitement is the sight of the train. School kids come out to wave, and the Amish throw them candy.
I've been coming up here for 5 years, and they've been doing this to us every morning.
They stand there with their sign.
Right, and they put up a sign, good morning to you.
Yeah.
And you know, it meant an awful lot to us because we feel that a new morning is a blessing from God.
Get that little red house. Get that little red house.
Well, here's one right here.
Oh, you missed it. You gotta get it far away. You have to get it. There's a clearing. Get that rock. There's another little red house way back there. That's what I said. There's one over there. I know I checked that one, but the other one was closer.
This is still a famous part of the line, and it lures romantics from all over the world. I met a man who spent the whole day hanging out of the rear of the train, relishing the happy days when he worked on a railroad.
I've been a rail fan most of my life. About the happiest year and a half of my life was when I worked for a railroad. And ever since then, I spend what time I can on them. What really annoys me is that they pay the engineers. I'd pay them if I could do this. It's just beautiful. I don't know what it is, the sound, feel, the smell even of the diesel locomotive. Any rail fan could tell you.
Most of this line is blasted out of solid rock, 4.5 billion years old. 30-foot snowdrifts, temperatures of 50 below zero. I get tired just reading about how they built this line.
We gotta lay down the tracks and tear up the trails. Open your heart, let the lifeblood flow. Gotta get on our way, 'cause we're moving too slow. Bring in the workers and bring up the rails. We gotta lay down the tracks and tear up the trails. Open your heart, let the lifeblood flow. Gotta get on our way, 'cause we're moving too slow. Get on our way, 'cause we're moving too slow.
This was a stunning achievement, penetrating yet another barrier isolating Canadians from each other and opening up a harshly beautiful landscape.
What's wrong? Well, the whole CTC is giving them problems.
It was a good thing I saw it when I did. because the train I was on isn't running anymore. The Canadian government says passenger service isn't worth subsidising when most people are in a hurry and prefer to fly or drive. So these slightly faded, elegant stainless steel cars are being shunted off to the retirement yard. Yet perhaps the government calculations overlooked another purpose of the train. It was a magic carpet of discovery for generations of Canadians.
So I did it once, and I really liked it, and I've come back, and I've told all my friends about it, and I've told Anna about it too, and I told her when we were taking this trip, I said, Anna, we're going to take the train. It's beautiful, you have to see it.
Just the differences, just the massive differences in one country, you know, and all you do is just take this train straight along, and you'll see the variety, you know.
The accommodations vary. The room service is acceptable if you do it yourself. And the berths are a snug fit. Yet, as I turned in for the night to the soothing click of the rails, I had a nagging thought. What happens to Canada when the train that built the country stops running? I expected to see snow in Canada, but not in early autumn. This train had a reputation for fine dining, though it's hard to have table manners to match.
Not so easy.
Meals are still cooked the old-fashioned way. They've obviously never heard of microwaves here.
Hello, hello. That feels pretty good on this train. I thought I'd come and see how you do it. You balance yourself. You seem pretty naturally balanced.
Well, after 26 years, you get the knack of it.
Yeah, right.
Not that hot enough. Well, she's going to grab anyway.
I suppose after your first million eggs, you get to a real feeling for it.
Yeah. I missed a few, no? Like I say, you can't win them all.
No. Very nice.
You missed that one, I guess, then? Yeah, you can
That's
have
better,
a try.
yeah. Doesn't matter if you're left-handed, huh?
Well, it doesn't matter. It's your left-hand hand.
I'll try that.
Right.
I'm sorry, Annie. My hand slipped.
Well, that's all right. How far are you going?
To Vancouver.
Well, that's fine. You can come back and give me a hand a little later on.
Okay. There we are. That's better, right? Now let's clean this mess up.
Travelling through this wilderness, I couldn't help but wonder how the people who built the railway got out here without a railway. It's not surprising that the Canadian West was uninhabited until the railway found a way through. There are still no roads or towns out here, just the train track. And as I reached the halfway point of my voyage, here in the midst of the loneliest country on earth, I thought a modest celebration was in order. This is not wine-growing country, but I'd managed to get my hands on a bottle of Canada's answer to champagne. It was unpretentious, good preparation for the tough part of my journey still ahead. This was the last stop before I headed north, and my fellow travelers looked ready for adventure.
We'll get you back in this week.
We were leaving the city slickers of Toronto far behind.
Okay, Ken.
The only sign of civilization out here is this train.
There's a lonesome whistle blow. There's a misty moonlit glow, and the lone conductor rides at the pace on a midnight train.
It's even got a singing baggage man, Bill Hoffmeister.
He sees the train and he sees the tracks, and he sees when all is well along the way. But it's not well at home. He got a call on the telephone. She said, I won't say where, but here's where I'm gonna stay. So his heart is breaking on the rear of the midnight train. He knows his darling ain't coming home again. Now it isn't easy being alone with all his pain, but he's the watchman on the rear of the midnight train. Wait, try a little something there, Doc.
I'd survived the civilized parts of Canada. Now I was headed out into the wilds. North to the Arctic, west over the endless prairies to the Rocky Mountains and the sea. Pioneer country, opened up by the iron road that was soon to close down.
Like this, caboose where he's riding on the midnight train.
This was my last chance to see it.
At the rear of the midnight train, he knows his darling ain't coming home again. And it isn't easy being alone with all his pain, but he's the watchman on the rear of the midnight train. Well, his heart is breaking at the rear of the midnight train. He knows his darling ain't coming home again. And it isn't easy being alone with all his pain, but he's the watchman on the rear of the midnight train.
Halfway across Canada, join the trek into the unknown.
Something out there was calling to me. I called back.
Ride the rails from the frozen north to the western shores.
Even as I traveled, the morning paper told me the train I was on was closing down behind me.
Murray Sayle rolls into the sunset on the last train across Canada.
Well, it certainly wasn't Florida.
Place for my head, a drink to the living, a toast to the dead. Oh, the song of the future has been sung. Oh, the battles have been won.
While it's no longer possible to ride the rails continuously from the Atlantic to the Pacific in Canada, sections of this once mighty line still exist.
Be with us when we continue our spectacular trip on the last train across Canada next Friday at 8. And stay with us now as Graham Greene takes us into the Nevada desert in search of UFOs and a hot lunch. A trip on Highway 93 is next on Great Drives.
When the green dark forest was too silent to be real, when the green dark forest was too silent to be real, and many are the dead men. Too silent to be real.